Who are we? Where did we come from? How did we come to be? These are questions that human beings have asked since we acquired the facility to ask questions. And across millennia, texts both secular and sacred have recorded our various journeys in search of answers. In the late 19th century, those journeys took a sharp turn as Thomas Henry Huxley leveraged Darwin's theory of evolution to argue that if new species of animals could evolve from earlier species, then so could humans. A new discipline emerged, paleoanthropology, the scientific study of human origins, combining insights from archaeology, anthropology, and the fossil record, which throughout the 20th century convincingly demonstrated that human beings did indeed evolve from earlier ancestors. More recently, analyses of the human genome have further revolutionized our understanding of human origins. There is now strong evidence that our species, Homo sapiens, shared planet Earth with a number of other species of early humans, and that we all got along fairly friendly, as many of us carry DNA from some of those species. So, what set us apart from those other human species, and why did we prevail? Perhaps our ability to think abstractly made the difference. We create art for pleasure. We use symbols to communicate information and ideas. We develop rituals that create cohesion and identity within a community. And that level of abstract reasoning is a profound part of what defines us. That's what makes us human. But new research is challenging this perspective by raising the tantalizing possibility that we may not be as different as we once thought, because some of the other early human species may have also had creative and abstract faculties, findings that may well be rewriting the story of humankind. Thank you. You know, when we try to answer some of those questions that really speak to who we are, how we fit in to a grand story, a grand narrative, issues of origin prove to be these powerful anchors of our understanding, at least in part. That's why many of us are consumed with trying to understand the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, the origin of it all. We are driven to understand the origin of galaxies and stars and planets. We want to know the origin of life. We want to know where intelligence comes from. And as we pass through the lineages, we want to know where our genus came from, where our species has come from. And this is a journey, as briefly noted in that piece, that we have vigorously pursued for some time. And our guest here today is one of the leading lights of the field. Our guest is Lee Berger, a name who many of you are deeply familiar with, who has made some of the real great discoveries in trying to further our understanding of those deep questions. He is the chair of the Paleoanthropology Department at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has had wonderful series on National Geographic, Nova, and he is here today to give us a sense of where we are in this grand quest. And the wonderful thing about Lee is not only is he one of the prime movers in our evolving understanding of our own evolution, he is also one of the great narrators of science, one of the great storytellers that speaks to this journey that we humans have been on to try to understand ourselves. And so it really does give me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Lee Berger.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, so in our discussion today, it'd be great to get caught up on the rapidly moving field of understanding human origins. But before we get to that particular story, which speaks to all of us, if you don't mind, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on your individual story because, look, I mean, part of the reason we have these conversations is, you want to inspire the next generation so that they can get a sense of, what it takes to be somebody who really changes our understanding in the way that you and your colleagues have. So, very beginning, you were born in Georgia, is that correct?
I wasn't born in Georgia. I was born in Kansas. I grew up in Georgia. Georgia is sort of the rural South, and hello, Brisbane. It's great to be here. I was a kid that grew up in sort of this idyllic rural area. I would spend my summers fishing and running through the woods and
like Dorothy,
without the dress, mostly.
Yep.
And I was fascinated even as a child with Native American artifacts which appear from plowed fields and geology. My grandfather was a frustrated oil wildcatter. One of those guys missing fingers from the chains and had pet chimpanzees and drove a Cadillac. And my father grew up in the back of a slipstream trailer in the Texas and Oklahoma regions. And so there was this deep fascination, but that wasn't the pathway they ended up. They were middle-class family. My mother was a math teacher. My father sold real estate and insurance. And I was a bright kid in a rural community. And in that time, there was kind of only a few places that a bright kid could go like that. And I think it's probably a lot like rural areas everywhere in the world. You were going to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, an accountant, and maybe particular to the South of America, a preacher. And one of those would become a politician sometime or something like that. So I had to get a scholarship. I got a naval scholarship, went to university at pre-law and hated every moment.
Really?
Except I got to take electives. I got to take electives in geology and archaeology. And for the first time in my life, which I really didn't even envision those as a career, they weren't in front of me as a way to a pathway. I saw people who absolutely adored what they did. I also found out that all that time spent exploring as a kid was valuable in finding fossils. I had a knack for it. I could go with a field trip and see the fossils they were looking for and find them. And I became one of these funny things of failing all my main courses, literally, F's and D's, on that.
Is that really true?
That's true. And making straight A's in all my electives. And I ended up in front of this naval officer, he was my academic officer. And one of the horrible things was at that time, if you'd accepted one of these officer scholarships,
you'd have to pay it back. Is that really true?
You have to pay it back if you fail out. And you go enlisted to do that. And Vanderbilt, where I was a very expensive school. It had been many, many years in the Navy. And so I'm standing there at attention. You got to imagine this. I'm in my, these sort of Top Gun white, standing there at attention in front of this officer who has my life in his hands. I'm at attention, and he's got this paper on his desk, which is my transcript, which is embarrassing because it has lots of F's and D's on it, And he says, Berger, Lieutenant Ron Stites, by the way, naval aviator. And he said, Berger, he says, what do you see here? And he pushes it across with one finger. And I remember going something like, failure, sir, something dramatic like that. And he said, I don't see that. He says, I see a young man who hasn't found what he loves. He said, if you promise me this, you will quit the university right now, go find what you love, and then come back. And he pointed to the geology and archaeology. I'll let you out. I'll sign your release papers with no obligation.
That's hugely unusual.
Boy, it was, it particularly for a naval officer.
Yeah.
And I said yes, and went and found myself, and eventually came back to university, and it was never work for a second after that. I'd found this place. And that took me on this journey that I was gonna, I came back, and of course I found paleontology like one does, and I found dinosaur paleontology like every young person does, and I was gonna be a dinosaur paleontologist. And I read a book called Lucy.
Sure.
By Don Johanson. I'm sure many people have read that. And in that, and in the discussions that were occurring around that, Don had said that there's something like a 1 in 10 million chance of discovering an ancient human relative fossil, even if you are in an area where they are known to be. And it was in Africa. And for some reason, that had incredible attractiveness and resonance to me. And maybe I shouldn't be proud of that. And maybe I shouldn't even reflect that. But it had, I was thinking, here's a field that even if you make a tiny discovery, you can change. I mean, at that time, it's hard for people, I think, to imagine. At that time in history, there were almost certainly more people who studied human origins and evolution than there were physical objects they studied. Imagine that. Imagine a field of science that has more practitioners than it does data. It does not make for a pretty field of science, I assure you. It makes for a very violent, possessive, scarce science and paleoanthropology was every bit of that in the late 80s and early 90s.
But there's something really interesting there. So you were driven more by the challenge than necessarily the specific content. I mean, if it was 1 in 10 million to find, a bone of, a giraffe or of some ancient sort, that might have been the direction that you went.
Absolutely. I think, okay, to be honest, I mean, who isn't interested in human origins, right?
Yeah,
who
sure.
isn't interested in where you come from? Same reason, I bet everyone in this audience has looked at their genealogy. You ever wondered why you do that? You do that because you understand that in your grandparents, great-grandparents, those distant lineages, there is meaning and the making of you.
Yeah.
I just do that, people like me just do that in the extreme. We're interested in the making of us. And so, of course I'm attracted to that. It had meaning to me, but yeah, I was up for that challenge. I buy lottery tickets too.
But is that the case? I mean, I was going to ask you, lottery ticket is not much of a risk because there's not much to lose there, but are you a risk taker?
I am. I think you'll hear a little bit about that as we go on, but I'm not a gambler, by the way, but I do buy a lottery ticket just because the story of my life has been sort of lottery-level discoveries.
But you guaranteed if you play the lottery enough that you will lose all your money. It's virtually guaranteed.
You're also guaranteed that
I
if you
just don't
don't
find it
buy
that
one,
interesting.
You're also guaranteed that if you don't buy a lottery ticket,
true too.
You will never win.
That's true too. But that suggests you should buy one ticket because you go from 0 odds to infinitely more.
That's all I do.
Which is still a tiny number.
That's all
but
I do.
Still, yeah.
One.
Okay. Anyway, so we won't fixate on
right,
the
we can
lottery.
talk about this all night.
Yeah. And so you decide to go in that direction. What's your next move?
To get to Africa. This is a closed field. And so I ended up making a phone call. Back in the days when you had to look up phone numbers in a phone book or call an operator, found Don Johanson's number in California. And I heard he was coming to talk to the Georgia Science Teachers Association. I called him up, got his bulldog of a secretary. I mispronounced his name. The phrase, Dr. Johansson in. She said, Johansson. I was almost in, and then got through to him amazingly. He took my call and I said, I live in Georgia, I'd like to meet you. And we did. And he took a liking to me. And he heard my story. And I'd had by then a degree, I was in geology and a degree in archaeology and anthropology. And he said, I need an assistant going to Olduvai Gorge, where I'm going to work. And you can be that assistant this summer. I'm made, right? My life's about to happen. Go away, scrabble together, get money for a plane ticket. I'm on my way in that direction. And I get 3 weeks before he's going, he calls up and says he lost his permit. He's not going. And he did something really strange there, which I've inquired, but I never got a really truthful explanation to. He took the moment to call Richard Leakey, which some of you will hear from the great Leakey family of Kenya, who he knew was holding the Harvard University Kubi 4 Field School at the same time. And he said, there's this young guy, and I've disappointed him, we're not going. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Don and Richard really didn't like each other very much. They were at war with each other as two of the biggest fossil finders of that time. And for some reason, Richard said, sure, he can come. And I went, and I found myself in Africa.
Where in Africa?
Kubi 4, northern Kenya, Lake Turkana, Jade Sea. And on the first day there, we arrived the day before after this just 2-day, lorry journey. And we get there, and I am so excited. I cannot sleep. I get up at 4 in the morning. I'm the only one up, except there's a light at this tea tent that they have. And I walked over there, and there I met John Templeton, who was preparing to go out for the day. One of Richard's great fossil finders. He looks at me, and he sees this enthusiastic kid awake at 4:30 in the morning. He said, "You want to come with me?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I do." Go out, and the next magical 6 or 7 hours was just where he taught me to see this landscape and see the fossils and understand it. And I'm enthralled. I have found this thing. And on the way back, 11 o'clock, it gets hotter than here in Brisbane, by the way, so it's terrible. And we're walking back, 11 o'clock in the morning, 100 meters from the Land Rover, and I look down, and there's a piece of a femur of a hominid on the ground. Pick it up. First day in Africa, first day on the fossil fields,
wow.
Beat the odds.
So that was 1 in 10 million, right?
I don't know. I don't know if that number's true anymore. We'll talk about that later.
Poetically.
Poetically, it was 1 in 10 million.
Yeah.
And man, I was hooked.
Yeah.
You couldn't have dragged me out of Africa. Ended up, I had applied to PhDs. That's the working degree in this field, as you know. And I, all over the world, got into most of the places, but I was waiting on. I'd gone to Richard then and Don for advice because I said, I want to be a fossil finder. And they said, "You're not working in East Africa." They said that to me, just like that.
Meaning?
Said, no place for a young American guy in that landscape. They were too young, they were too violent, it was all, partitioned out. And both of them gave me the same advice. They said, "Go to South Africa." This was, you got to remember the context of this. This is late 1989. They just announced that Mandela was going to be released in February of 1990. And they said, the landscapes may be changing. They heard that a fellow named Philip Tobias, one of the great professors of this field, had a vault full of fossils that had been discovered over the last 30, 40 years, but hadn't been described really because of the apartheid government's repression.
So there's a vault in South Africa.
In South Africa, at the University of Witwatersrand. And I had applied there. And so I called from a tiki, but hadn't heard from him. So I called from a tiki box. For those of you who don't know what that is, it was a payphone. You put the little shillings in, and he answers on the other side with, "Oh dear boy, when are you arriving?" That was my acceptance letter to the University of Witwatersrand. And so that's where I went. And it was a crazy time, you can imagine, 1990 there, as Mandela was released and the place is blowing up. But I threw myself into walking the high felt of that area. And as I was coming out of this East African mentality of 1 in 10 million.
Yeah.
There hadn't been a hominid discovery at a new site in sub-equatorial Africa since 1947, 48.
Nothing.
Nothing, not a new site. There's a lot, apartheid government.
Yeah, right.
A little thing like that.
Right.
It said, they didn't particularly like the idea of people searching for the idea of the commonality of all humankind, and the subject wasn't particularly popular. But I was looking for a site that had a lot of bones, and found one. A giant one called Gladysville. So I was given a job, by the way, way out of my league as a table doctor teaching anatomy. I'd never taught anatomy in my life, but I read well. And
you're still a doctoral student now?
Yeah, a doctoral student. And then I was teaching this BSc course an honors course in science, which I was teaching the human origins component of it. You can all tell how highly qualified I was for this. These are the first courses I'd ever taught in that. So I enlisted them, I drafted them as part of the course to come out and work for me at Gladysville under the argument that that's how you learn. It's practical. So it was a form of slave labor, I know, but don't tell anyone. And 16 days into this first expedition, Michelle Erasmus, a young woman on this course, picked up a rock and turned it over and handed it to me and said, "Is that a tooth?" They're sticking out of this rock is a hominid tooth. There it is, a hominid tooth. That's one on the left was the first one. The next morning, the second one comes out. 2 teeth. You guys go, really? I can see you can hear the the awe in the audience, right? 2 teeth. Those 2 teeth got me in National Geographic magazine. That is that. And and then I threw myself into this site. There I am, throwing myself into this site. I knew that the next rock I would turn over would have that half of a mandible of a hominid in it. Because, 2 teeth in 16 days. And I could dine on that at conferences for the rest of my life. Because at that time in history, you could.
Because there was so little that had already been found.
Nothing existed.
Yeah.
And it did not happen.
At least not for the first week.
How about the first 17 years?
Yeah.
Don't go too awe. It's not that bad. I was having a great career. I was doing all the things a scientist does. I had discoveries. I had devised an idea that the Tong child, a famous fossil, was killed by a bird of prey. That started a whole scientific endeavor itself. I'm very proud of. I was one of the first scientists, very controversial, say that early Australopithecines, the most primitive of the ape men, so to speak, had long arms and short legs when we thought they were all human proportioned, which got me in a lot of trouble in the 1990s. But I didn't have that discovery. And by the end of the 1990s, just on the verge of the 21st century, I'd risen to this position. I took over Philip Tobias's chair. He'd retired. I was a kid, though. And, I began to hear at these international conferences, here I am in charge of all of this now. I've never seen someone go so far on 2 teeth. And, while I was naive, I wasn't naive enough to know that was not a compliment. That was a sort of, this field was possessive, and it was about a mythology built around the discoverers. You almost had to be touched by God, if that's not too much, to discover these things. And then it began, not just these things, but good ones. They started putting a level on it. And I went through the worst years of my life in the early 21st century. It was terrible because I was becoming the poster child for the idea that the age of exploration was dead, that there were no new fossil fields to discover. There was even a paper published in 2001 by the biggest fossil finder of that period, you know who I'm talking about, who said, there will not be any new discoveries that change the way we understand human evolution, that there will be no new fossil fields found, and that we should stop training people to be young paleoanthropologists because it is insanity to have a field where there are more people studying this than there are objects that they study. That killed funding for exploration. Killed it dead.
And that's a fairly common kind of rhythm, right? In the late 1890s, there was a statement in physics that all the fundamental laws had been discovered and all that remains is to determine this or that constant of nature to the 6th decimal place. And then we have special relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics. So I suspect you did not take that as the final word on
it
this
hurt.
idea.
It hurt my wallet.
Yeah.
It hurt my ability to do exploration, but you're right. I knew the history of dinosaur paleontology. Same thing. Early 19th century, we have it all. Of course, we didn't. But it was tough. I'll tell you how tough it was that my university, convinced by the external forces of these big discoverers of fossils, said, you know what, we're going to close your exploration unit. This is now 2006, 2007. And we're going to hire, under the convincing of these outside forces of the university, a young person to come in and revolutionize it. Because the idea was what was getting on the covers of Nature and Science were the sort of imaging, the sort of new technologies that were being applied to fossils.
So the existing ones, just analyzing them.
We were never going to find more. And I found myself in this really weird thing I hope none of you ever do in your entire lives, of actually sitting on a committee to replace myself. I was like 40 years old. 40, a little older than that.
Were you resigned to this being the end of this career channel, or?
I was soul searching, and I ended up, I remember the day this all happened. Next part of the story. I was sitting at home on my computer, and I was doing what I guess all people of our generation do when you absolutely have no idea what your future direction is. I was Googling my future, just trolling the internet saying, what is a guy who's dedicated, became the poster boy of failure in exploration. What am I going to do next? And at that moment, I became the singular last human being, I am convinced, on Earth to discover Google Earth. And the reason it is so stupid is I had been a pioneer, as you know, Brian, in the 90s on trying to take technology, handheld GPS, satellite images, and combine them into a way to make discoveries. I was convinced there was something there, but the satellite images cost $10,000 a sheet, the pixelation was terrible, the handheld GPSs were terrible and expensive, and I had failed at that. I'd run a 3-year National Geographic funded expedition to do it, and hadn't really done much at all. And but then I'm sitting here looking at Google Earth. I noticed that little white box up in the corner for GPS coordinates, and I had like some of the most expensively obtained GPS coordinates ever. And I put it in, and it does this, right? It does a zoom into thing, and I of course, looked I looked at my house first, I'll admit that. See if you're naked by the pool, that kind of thing, and I wasn't. And then I applied it to these sites, and it didn't land on the sites that I'd mapped in the 90s. And it didn't take me long to Google why it didn't, because the US government had owned the satellites at that time and put deliberate error into them so they couldn't use for terrorism and that sort of thing. And so that with the sort of error that was in the handheld GPSs created a compounding error. I was devastated. I mean, I'd wasted 3 years of my life. I'd published some of that data.
Wasted in the sense that you thought you were looking in one area when it was actually displaced from where it actually was?
I thought I was mapping things, and I wasn't mapping things. I was mapping nonsense. And that's not good, and it's not great for your scientific reputation to be, publishing that kind of nonsense. But I quickly learned that I could see the sites on Google Earth that I intended to, and I started moving those dots from the wrong place to the right place.
You can see them through features in the landscape.
Yeah, you'll see some right there. Like you see those trees? See those little clusters of trees?
Yeah,
That's
sure.
the green dots?
Yeah.
Those clusters of trees are marking cave sites and fossil sites. There were about 103 known at that point. And I started looking and started saying, wow, if that's a cave site, then that looks like a cave site. And so out I went to ground truth them, out walking in this sort of environment to see whether these were actually, I knew they couldn't. This was the most explored area on planet Earth for these things. There's no way they were. And as I started exploring, on the very first day out, I created this target map, if you can imagine, printed it out as far away from Gladysville as I could get. Because I had 17 years of failure in that spot. I knew it better than anyone else. I went all the way 30 kilometers away to the edge of these dolomitic limestones, the greatest potential for these. And on the first day, found over 20 new sites. Went from 103 to 123, one day. I was blown away. I mean, we'd missed it all, right in front of us. And what they looked like were, they were these clusters of trees.
By site, you mean new caves?
Caves and some fossil sites. So there were only, let me put that in perspective, there were only 17 known fossil sites. I'd found 4 of them back in that 1990 expedition, and then all of a sudden, there are more of them. And I started going out every day, over and over again, one after the other, and suddenly every day I was building this map. January, February, March, April, May, June, July. By then I found over 750 new sites in the most explored area on planet Earth. I was like, oh my God, this is my contribution. This is what I will leave the future, this almost unlimited potential of discovery.
And was it mostly tree clumps as the operative way of finding them?
I'm sure we have an image of tree clumps. That's what they look like. Everyone's excited. I can hear the awe in the audience. Look at it. But in that tree clump, wild olives, white stinkwoods clustered together, you could see them from space. And in those are often depressions, holes in the ground. sometimes fossils. It had been mined often. They were mining for lime in that area back in the late 1900s, early 20th century. And eventually I had moved right back into the area of Gladysville. And I knew there was nothing there to find, but I'd gone after a couple of these tree clumps and walked up to actually this one. And went to it first, and the first rock I turned over had a fossil in it, which surprised me because this thing is like 800 meters from where I'd spent 17 years working, and I'd missed these fossils. I felt like an idiot. But I was fossil hunting that day, in cave hunting that day, so I just took the maps down and then went up in the thing and found 47 new sites in this one valley right next to the valley I'd been in for 17 years unsuccessfully. It bugged me a little bit. Yeah, I had that reaction too. A tragedy had occurred a couple of weeks before, which I haven't told you about, and that is that the young man that was going to take over, we'd selected to bring in this new technology and stuff, he lived in the UK and was killed in a motorcycle accident. And we had already hired all the young postdocs, bought the equipment and stuff. And so one of them, a couple of days later, came into my office, Job Kivy, and he was a postdoc, and he said, would I be his supervisor? And don't call me heartless. I said, no. You're a lab guy, I'm a field guy. And then I thought about it a moment. I said, but I've just found this site. I've just found this cluster of trees, and it's bugging the heck out of me why I missed this. And so if you want to take another look at it with me, maybe I'll teach you to be a fossil finder. And so off we went. August 15th, 2008. Job, myself, my then 9-year-old son Matthew, my dog Tao, we arrived there in that beautiful wilderness area, and I take them up, I tell them how we found it, a much shorter version of what I just told you, walk up to the site, and I say, okay, there's this little hole in the ground, go find fossils. If you find one, call me, I'll identify it, let's see what this site has to offer. And with that, Tao and Matthew are gone. They race off, and they're leopards and giraffe and stuff, and I think they're going to chase those, and they'll see them at lunchtime. And so I'm standing there, that's not funny, that's what they were doing, and I'm standing there telling Job, the miners had found it, but they didn't put much blast. And Matthew goes off and he says, Dad, I found a fossil. He calls me 15 meters off. And I start walking towards him. That's actually what I saw, this picture, taken at the moment. He's only this little clump of rock. And 5 meters away, I knew his and my life were about to change forever. Because inside of that rock, I could see something that would look innocuous to you. That. I heard the audience go, wow. I went, wow, because that was a hominid clavicle. And at that moment in history, I was probably one of the world's only experts on hominid clavicles. I'd done my PhD on that bone. All 6 or 7 of them that had been found to date from that time. I knew it exactly, it was sigmoid shape. Matthew said, I cursed, I don't believe that. I turned that rock over, and on the back of it was part of a mandible and the rest of a skeleton coming out of that block. Matthew found a partial skeleton of a hominid, one of the rarest things in all of history. There were literally probably 7 or so. Lucy, Turkana Boy, ones you would hear of, and that was it. And he just found one. And that was
just lying on the surface?
Lying on the surface. No idea why. In that rock. And that would lead to the discovery of a new species that you'll see. I mean, beautiful skulls, things like that.
All in the area right around there?
That's right. In the rock, they have to be prepared out. Skulls they're just beautifully complete from it. Australopithecus sediba, we would eventually call it. A 2-million-year-old hominid, things like this. We had never seen things like that in the fossil record, and as we would prepare these blocks out, by the way, that takes about 22,000 person-hours to get to that state. From its concrete-like things, we would eventually find skeletons. First time in history, 2 skeletons had been found together at the same deposit. And suddenly, my life changed.
Yeah.
I went from the guy who was making a career off 2 teeth to this, one of the richest fossil sites ever discovered in Africa. We named a new species, Australopithecus sediba, got on the cover of Science.
Well done.
You ever been on the cover of Science?
Not yet. Not yet.
3 times. That's for, people that understand, being on Science or Nature for us are fossils, not us. It's like for a rock star being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine.
Well,
it's
I have done that.
Oh, yeah, well, congratulations. And, I was living the dream. My project grew from 1 scientist to 40 to 100 plus in a matter of months and then a year. Paper after paper in the highest journals. I was applying technology. I mean, we had the coolest stuff. We were taking synchrotron, highest energy light sources in the world, and we were turning them into these mobile objects that we were doing. We were able to create and reconstruct these just amazing things by using technology. It was the perfect time, the perfect moment to make discoveries. Computers had come along, you could image stuff. I got to apply open access models to it, and I got to bring in early career scientists and other people, which was just, believe it or not, anathema to our field.
And open access was rare.
Yeah.
Not only in science in general, but in your field in particular, which was fairly hold on to your results.
Well, it was
right?
a field of scarcity. You didn't find these things, and that was it. And, time went by, 2, 3, 4 years. And then I started building this laboratory because we found things like organics over in Malapa, which by the name of the site I named Malapa, or my home in the Sutu language. And I started building this laboratory and suddenly got locked out of the site and realized I hadn't been exploring. I hadn't bought that lottery ticket, right. And contrary to what you say, in my field, exploration is the buying of the lottery ticket. If you're not exploring, you're not going to make the discoveries. And so I was thinking, well, what am I going to do while I'm locked out of this site? I got this big team ready and that, and I remember that map that I'd created back in 2008. We're now all the way up in 2013. And at that moment, a former student of mine, Pedro Boshoff, walks through the door. He's bankrupt, barefoot, in tears. He'd lost everything. And
playing the lottery.
He went diamond mining in West Africa, but that's as close to that as you can get. And the coincidence of that was I was beginning to think about what I could do with that map I'd created of now 800 or 900 localities that I'd stopped doing the moment Matt said, "Dad, I found a fossil." And I was thinking, because one of the interesting things is they're not just on the surface. Every one of those points is potentially a doorway into the underworld, into these spaces beneath the ground, these labyrinths of cave spaces that cut through that area, hundreds of kilometers of them. But no one explored them at the time.
The general sense was there wasn't going to be a find to be made.
That's
underground,
right, underground, because the idea was that the older caves were on the surface because the ground's eroding away, so the older stuff's on the surface, and the caves underground are actually the newer caves. And so the coincidence of all of that and the serendipity of all of that was that Pedro was my caving buddy back in the 90s. And so I said, okay, let's go look at these. Let's use my map and go underground. But what I want you to do is to actually, use these sites to go to the places we think we know best first. Because I learned a little bit from Gladysville, things in your own backyard might be places. And so off he went. He came back very quickly. He said he wasn't physiologically appropriate to get into many of the caves. He was too fat. And so I very reluctantly enlisted with him two amateur cavers, Steve Tucker and Rick Hunter, who were physiologically appropriate for getting into these sites. And out they went, and they did a very natural thing. They took my map, all very excited about it, and went to every cave that they didn't know about first. And so
they had explored some of these caves.
Oh, lots of them had been explored by amateurs and stuff like that, the bigger ones and stuff.
Right.
So they went for all the new things. It's human nature. And so I was getting reports. We're now moving, if you imagine, sort of June, July, August of 2013. They weren't finding much, little bits and pieces, but nothing really exciting. Then at the last bit, they went to a cave called the Rising Star Cave, which is a very well-known cave. It's right, to paint the picture of this, there are a series of very famous caves like Sterkfontein and Swartkrans, which all appear in one valley. That was the historical place of discovery. 90% of the fossil discoveries of ancient human relatives had occurred at 3 sites that are within a kilometer of each other. The Rising Star Cave is a kilometer from that, right in the middle of this thing. And so everyone's been in it. It's used for training of cavers. I'd been in it in the 90s, there's nothing there. But they were dutifully going through everything. And they went in this one night, September 13th, and went through the cave 4.5 hours, reached an area called Dragon's Back. This is this area, imagine it's like 120 meters back into a cave system, 30 meters underground. And they crawled up this Dragon's Back, which is a rock collapse, to the top of it. And at the very top of it, Steve was trying to take a picture, get a picture of himself, and he slid into this little slot, and his legs went down a hole, and he told Rick, it goes. And in cavers, that means like it doesn't stop. That's a big word, I know. And being young and skinny and insane, down he went. Not knowing if it opened up into a big thing and he dies or whatever, if he could get out. And it goes 12 meters down into a chamber. And inside that chamber, they saw some bones on the ground. Little white specks like those. They didn't know what they were, but they took pictures of them. That picture. And they went out, took them forever to get out. The next couple of days, I'm sitting at home, 9 o'clock at night, and my intercom, this is Johannesburg, so we have gates and everything long distance to your house. My intercom goes 9 o'clock at night. I answer it, and there's Pedro on the other side. He says, "You're going to want to let us in." Creepy like that. And I almost didn't. Then I did. And Steve and Pedro come in. They open their laptop. They show me this picture, and they showed me the next picture. There I got one. There I got one. That is a hominid mandible. And immediately I realized that that's not just any hominid. I could tell by the audience reaction. They too realized that that is a primitive hominid because the tooth morphology extends to a larger and larger molar row, which I could tell at least 80% of you knew instantly. And I thought, oh my goodness, no human being, I guarantee you, had ever seen an image like that anywhere on the planet. Like I said, 22,000 hours to get that skull out. This is laying on the floor. And every picture they showed me had another one and another one and another one. And they described the situation it was in. This 130 meters back, up this climb, and down this shaft that they happily said, the chute-like thing they described was 19.5 centimeters at its widest, 17 centimeters at its narrowest, with all these terrible moments in it. And these guys, these guys are the size of paper. And I was like, I will never do this. That's it. That's the entrance. That's the wide part. Look at his helmet, folks, to get an idea of that. You want to see how really bad it is? This? Yeah, here we go. This is what it looks like to get there. This is the easy part, folks. This is what we call Superman's crawl. And this is where you have to, Superman, because, the flying position. You extend your arm out, and you go. Oh, come on, I get through this. That's not terrible. You go through this. You climb Dragon's Back. You then get to the hard part, the chute area that you go. It's not that bad, folks. It really isn't. Even in this dark, I can see the claustrophobes all going, looking down at the ground.
Well, you're making me anxious right now. I need a sedative for an MRI.
You want to be anxious? Let's look at what it's like, if we can, of what it's like to come through the chute. I think the next video does that. This makes me anxious,
I did that once when I was a baby, I think.
You came out feet first? That explains
Maybe,
a lot.
yeah, right. So is that now at the end
That's
of the journey?
in the first chamber. You're in these spaces, in these very narrow spaces, and that's what we had to do. So you got to remember, I'm seeing this. I go through there, and I'm wondering how we're going to do this. By the way, in order to test, I'd hired these amateurs to see whether it was real, because I'm trusting the entire reputation of my team if I put together an expedition to do this. I didn't tell you this, because right after Pedro and Steve left, I'm all full of this, oh my goodness, this is gigantic discovery. They're lying on the floor. 2 a.m. in the morning, I called the head of missions at National Geographic Society, Terry Garcia, 2 a.m. my time. It was like earlier in the US. And even though he had caller ID, he answered the phone. And I showed it. I said, are you near a computer? I showed him those pictures. And I said, if you are ever going to believe in me right now. That's explorer speak for I need money. Don't.
And they had funded you in the past? Or? Yeah, okay.
And he paused for a little bit, and he said, okay, Lee, do what you need to do. That's thunder speak for okay, spend some, but don't do too much on that. I hung up the phone, and I got cold feet. Because I'm just risking. I have this incredible. I'm living the dream of science. I have this incredible team, one of the biggest teams ever assembled for this. All these prestige papers and all that, and I've just risked the entire reputation onto amateurs in this sort of situation, a place I will never go.
But you saw the photo, right? Was that?
You ever seen Photoshop?
No, seriously?
Yeah.
You're worried that could? Wow.
People do funny things.
Huh.
Oh, come on. Someone just faked a shark picture and it was a plastic model. You saw that from Greece. I mean, they'll do anything.
Wow.
I've seen Bigfoot too. It's not. So how was I going to test this? So I knew someone I trusted that could fit in there, my then 15-year-old, very skinny son, Matthew. So I taught him how to use a scientific camera and scale, sent him through, went through with him, sent him down.
Was Dad at all concerned about this?
Did he damage the camera? Oh, man. His mother didn't know. So there I am, seen in the dark. He's down 30 minutes. He comes back up. He has a camera. And, as his head emerges from this death-defying thing, because I'm going for Father of the Year, you can all tell there. I didn't go, are you okay? I went, and he turns around and he said, Dad, it was so beautiful. My hands were shaking for 3 minutes before I could take a picture. And he shows me the back of that, and there they are. It's real. So I go out that night after coming out of that terrible thing, and I'm like, how am I going to do this? I need people. I need people who can climb, who are skinny, who have degrees and PhDs and can excavate precious material. How am I going to find that? And now, of course, the amateur community knows about this, right?
So you're worried.
I'm worried.
Yeah.
They're just lying there.
I mean, you can't close this off. I mean, it's
not even on my land. It's on someone else's land.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, how do you do this? And so I guess I did what anyone would do. I put a Facebook ad out. You don't have to read that. It says, I need skinny scientists that are willing to drop everything and come for an expedition. They have to have a PhD or equivalent or be studying for one. They have to have excavation experience, climbing experience, caving experience, not claustrophobic, work well in teams, are willing to work for free. And I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do, and you're going to risk your life. And I sent that out, and I thought, there are 3 or 4 people in the world might qualify for that. I got 57 qualified applicants, of which I selected 6 of them who were the most qualified, who just happened to be young women. And they were extraordinary. And we launched what was called the Rising Star Expedition after the cave itself to get these things. I designed this whole system, this NASA-like system, with a command center and 3.5 kilometers of cables with security cameras and all that doing it. And we started this expedition. And I also decided, by the way, to live stream it to the whole world. Had 1 million followers by the end of this expedition. Day 2, we knew I was wrong. It wasn't a hominid skeleton. It was more than one hominid skeleton. We had 3 right femurs. By the end of the week, we had brought up from underground in these extreme circumstances more hominid fossils that had been found at the richest site in the world to that date. Sterkfontein Caves, which was a kilometer away. 1 week. It'd taken 90 years to get that at Sterkfontein. By the end of an expedition at 3.5 weeks, we discovered the richest series of hominid discoveries in all of history. In the middle of it, we were just, everyone knew this was like, it was like a moon moment. You know, you can see the emotion, I think, on the faces. We were just in awe of this moment that we were in, that
Wow.
discovery was happening. And, you know, this was like scientific nirvana, you know, and you'll see the kind of conditions they were working in, you know, deep underground. This is what they were doing in these spaces. They were incredible. They were heroic. One time during an interview in that period, I said, you know, I'm looking at these, I'm seeing them on these images. They're like astronauts.
Yeah,
They're so remote from us when this happens. They're like underground astronauts. Boy, I wish I'd never said that. Because I've got hate mail from around the world because I know it should be troglonauts or, you know, speleonauts or whatever, but I said it and it caught on and then I got in trouble for it. But it stuck. And you know, you can see how big they are, by the way. Look at Becca here. This is the kind of size of people that get into these spaces.
And how do they carry the bones out?
In little tiny bags inside of this we had this hugely complex development that I'd done of Tupperware that you closed and put the thing in foil and then in toilet paper, inside a Tupperware, inside a waterproof bag, and hand carried out in a sort of chain. We would go, the lab suddenly got busy and scientists started flying in from all over the world. I think you can see a picture of the lab that we constructed coming up there. We would work all day. All these scientists were arriving. It was so cool. It was live science happening in the middle of the world. We were working late into the night. I mean, you know, there's some images I think of us at night in there. And, you know, all this time we're watching these images of them on the screen going back and forth, back and forth. And they were working for hours and hours and hours. And it was unbelievable. These are the kind of images we saw. I mean, this is incredible. You see these images of, that's the kind of thing that you're watching. I would spend the next 7 years staring at images like this place. I just want the audience to know that I am an equal opportunity child abuser. That's my daughter, Megan, who's in the audience today. Somewhere here. She's University of Queensland Vet School, right here. That's a position called chute troll. She's up at the top there, and her job was to go up and down the chute. I used her to test the safety equipment before I sent the astronauts in. I didn't tell her mother that either. Look, I'm sending other people's children in. I need to be able to risk my own, and I'm serious about that. I was taking other people's kids into the extreme spaces. Into that expedition, it was extraordinary. And, you know, from this little chamber, deep underground, a tiny space that's sort of 10 meters long by 5 meters wide, we discovered over 1,500 individual fossils from a 1 meter by 50 centimeter excavation. The richest single, put that in perspective, folks, to that point in history, in sub-equatorial Africa, there'd probably been 1,100 individual fossils found, about 80% isolated teeth. 3 weeks. And there was clearly more of them in there.
And could you tell how many individuals were?
After we started looking at these fossils, you know, we had skulls. We had actual skulls, and skulls are rare. You know, we had that one from there. We had skulls like this, you know, and we had slightly bigger ones and little ones. It was clear they were really weird from it. We had dentition. We had, you know, dozens and dozens of teeth. We had foot bones that were just completely things like this, you know. You should go awe for this, because paleontologists around the world went, holy cow. These are not the kind of things we see in the fossil record, you know, the primitive hominid fossil record. We had hands that were actually sitting articulated, just like that one, just like that. It was unbelievable and stupidly odd. We knew that as we were looking at it. You were looking at a thing that was different. At the end of it, we had this just assemblage. You could lay out just dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, 1,500 fossils for 15 plus individuals. It was unbelievable. And then I got to play science.
terms of interpreting what the heck this is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I got to play science in a way that was really, really nasty. I said, you know, there was a thing in our field about you had to have experience to study ancient hominid fossils. And there was even someone who said that if you haven't studied one before, you shouldn't be allowed to study another one. That's the shaker kind of mentality of science, where eventually you all die out and everyone just looks at the things, I guess. And so I picked particularly young people from across, the very best and brightest, hugely diverse, and brought them together as a gigantic team to study these. And we had the time of our lives. The only rule was they had to release all of their data sets to the team. So we shared data and made it open access across the field. And then we named a new species and started finding more of them, not just in that chamber, but in other chambers nearby. We found a skeleton from a chamber 100 meters away that was in an alcove up on the wall. A beautiful thing. Maybe one of the bigger individuals we found. It had a beautiful skull. I mean, just almost the complete thing that you could look at. You could actually see this face of this tiny-brained hominid. A hominid that had a brain about a third the size of a human. It was clearly primitive. There's one. You can see it. They had this kind of rounded cranium, kind of like a human, but they had these brow ridges that you can see there. They had a flattened face. They had prognathic, that is, their nose stuck out. The teeth were small but primitive, like I saw in that first mandible. But that's where most studies in our field would have ended. But we had these bodies, everything from neonates to the elderly, and so we could begin to construct the whole anatomy, and what we saw was this bizarre mosaic creature. You know, it had shoulders like an ape, it had a spine like a mini Neanderthal, a pelvis like a hominid that was 3 or 4 million years old, like Lucy's pelvis. But then as you move down the limbs towards the feet and the hands, they became more and more advanced until you reach these hands that, while they were curved, they were almost superhuman-like with really long thumbs. And the feet, as you got to them, the long, skinny legs, and they became almost human-like, except for having slightly curved toes. It was like this mishmash of every species that we'd found from like 3 million years old to, say, 1 million years old. We would put it all together, and we could look at this creature. You could actually see its physical body effectively and reconstruct it and compare it to other hominids. And so you got this visual reconstruction of this living creature standing next to all these other hominids.
Now, if you just say it had the feet, you would have reconstructed a different looking creature.
We would have said human.
Huh.
If it had hands, we would have said, funny human, with a long thumb. If we'd had the teeth, we would have said, maybe it's a mini robust Australopithecine or primitive Australopithecine. If we'd had the face, we would have said, oh, that's an Australopithecine. If we had the head, cranium, we would have said Homo habilis. Maybe a bit of Homo erectus thrown in there. If we had the spine, we would have said funky Neanderthal, but there are no Neanderthals in Africa. So if we had the shoulders, I might have said gibbon. And so we did what scientists do time and again. We named a new species, Homo naledi. We put it in the genus Homo because of that head. And because we felt the overall great adaptation was to bipedalism and living on the ground, that this was in our ilk. More so than Australopithecine, but we debated it a long time. It hovered there on the edge of both sides, depending on what part you looked at. You know, we could build it. This is one of John Gertsch's great reconstructions. We could build this whole image of this guy. And that was so exciting because maybe the audience, people in the audience, I bet some of them realize that we didn't get to do this with certainty before this moment. Almost every other discovery you've ever heard about in this field is built from scraps. And often built from scraps that we are not 100% sure belong to the same thing. And with the exception of perhaps, I'd argue, Neanderthals, we just don't have a highly diverse record of young and old. And so the ability to build an image of one of these, and then lots of them at different age groups, and the ability to understand them was truly unknown at that time. I mean, Australopithecus sediba and Malapa had been extraordinary, but it wasn't this. This was that on steroids. And we were sitting there with this knowledge that something weird was going on. And here's what that weird thing was. By the end of the first week, as we were sitting there in this command center, you imagine everyone, and you saw the emotion on everyone's face, which is like, I had to buy, there was a joke going around during the expedition of, we're going to need a bigger vault. Remember that scene in Jaws where the shark comes up and goes, we're going to need a bigger boat. We need a bigger safe, because we'd brought these safes out to keep the 5 pieces we were certain we were going to find. We had 400 by the end of the thing. But what I didn't kind of highlight was we had only hominids. Only hominids. From those deep chambers, nothing else was coming out. Just these fossil human relatives. I remember very poignantly at the end of the first week, this is all happening to us. At the end of the day, these filthy underground astronauts come out. One of them, Marina, had brought out the last bit, and I look at it, and it's all hominid. And I said, are you guys cheating? Are you actually picking up only the, and leaving the animals behind? And they went, nope. We're taking them as they come. And over beers that night with a couple of scientists, I remember this really powerful moment that was occurring because, a lot of us had trained in lots of things. I was a geologist and archaeologist, and part of being an archaeologist, you train as sort of forensic anthropology. And one of the things you learn as a forensic anthropologist when you're studying natural occurrences, whether they're collected by carnivores or catastrophe, they're always mixed. You get animals and everything. And in fact, in the hominid record, it's like 99.9% animals, 0.1% hominids. We had never seen a situation that was all hominids. Well, we actually had, but not in the ancient fossil record. We see it all the time in human assemblages. And the reason we see it all the time in human assemblages is because humans sort themselves after death from the natural world. And we have places that we put ourselves mostly separate. Sometimes we put our dead poodles with us, or if you're a pharaoh, your dead cats and falcons, but mostly we put ourselves with each other or alone. And so it was becoming pretty clear, even by week 2, that there must be another explanation. And so when we published this new species, Homo naledi, in 2015, in the journal eLife, you'll remember that, we said something incredibly controversial. We said that the only possible reason that there could be only hominids in this deep, dark, remote chamber is that they put themselves there. They must have gone through some sort of ritualized behavior of carrying their dead into these spaces, and I'll tell you before it's in your mind, no, the spaces haven't changed that much.
No other entrance?
No other entrances. They are going into this extraordinary space, the way we do, and they're taking their dead in there, and they're disposing of them in a ritualized manner. And I want to be careful there because ritual means different things to different people. I was very careful of saying ritual means repeated. Because while the world accepted our new species very readily, because we had so much, to say that a tiny-brained hominid was actually disposing of its dead in a ritualized manner in a place like this, that was received in, so you ever heard the saying of, it floated like a lead balloon? That was kind of how the reception was. Because those type of mortuary behaviors are related to a big brain. We claim it as ours. It is a human thing. It's done by humans. It's done because our big brain and the way we are, and it's only happened 60, 70,000 years ago in our lineage, maybe a little earlier, And even the cases where people say it may have occurred in the other large brain thing, Neanderthals, the few cases where they think there may be burial, that took decades of fighting to even be remotely thing. We were stepping into the definition of human. By the way, did you know there's no definition of human, Brian?
If you asked me, I'd be hard pressed to give you a definition, so I can well imagine.
So is Webster's dictionary and every other science.
It probably is kind of circular, right? It's like humans are people who are kind of like humans, or something like that.
He's not joking. Look it up. Look at Google. Google the definition of a human. It'll say having the characteristic of people or a person. If you look up Homo sapiens, it'll say having the characteristic of a human. You know why? Because we don't have an outgroup.
Right.
Everything's like us that does like us, and we see ourselves as totally human exceptionalism.
But can I ask you, I mean, just to play devil's advocate for a second, I mean, you know, obviously I know you fielded 1,000 variations on the following theme, but one at least can imagine other explanations. I mean, the one that comes to mind for me, which I'm sure you can shoot down, is what if everybody went into the cave alive and the ones you found are the ones that couldn't get back out?
Yeah, great. Like people like me had gone in or whatnot. I actually got in the cave, but I'll tell you that's for later. The answer is that we threw one of the largest scientific teams in history at this problem. We did not say it lightly. And we eventually, like Sherlock Holmes, had worked our way through. We could prove they weren't washed in there. We could prove that they had come in over time. Some were earlier, some were later. They had come in whole. We could see that as bodies. They were violating gravity and all that. It wasn't a catastrophic event. It wasn't some movement of water. There were no evidence of carnivores or scavenging or any marks on their bodies. And eventually, after that and lots of other evidence, we had eliminated all the probable, and we were left with the improbable, that we had discovered the first time in history that a non-human species, and something that clearly is outside of our grade, that was practicing some sort of deliberate mortuary. That remains controversial. I'm hoping not for long, but it remains controversial today. And what really made it tough was with this tiny brain hominid that by then people had rapidly began telling us we didn't have a date for it. We couldn't tell you how old it was. Now that's a problem in paleoanthropology because everyone thinks dates, wrongly by the way, are super important for saying where something fits, because everyone thinks evolution works like a biblical story of, Afarensis begets, Homo habilis begets, Homo erectus. It doesn't happen that way. Species can arise as a fission or breakout, and the others can continue quite happily. That's why we can see coelacanths today.
Sure. They just keep on going.
They keep on going. And so it's much more complex. But humans have always seen themselves as so exceptional that we have this sort of image that once the next better mousetrap evolves, nothing can. So we had scientists that were saying that the morphology of naledi was showing that it was really probably just some kind of primitive Homo erectus. It must be, when they say that, they mean 2 million, 2.2, 2.3 million years old, or it's another species of primitive Homo, or it's even a late Australopithecine, but all of them were, 1.5 million, 2.5 million years old. You could look at its anatomy, but we threw the kitchen sink at getting a date. Because no one had ever, you gotta remember, you gotta be sympathetic with us. No one had ever found a whole bunch of hominids lying on the floor in a dirt cave and then immediately beneath the floor. We didn't have technology, we invented it. With, by the way, quite a lot of Australian researchers, some from Griffith University here and others with your great facilities here. And we broke through the day. Yes, indeed, that does deserve a round of applause. Thank you, Australian Research Committee and Australian government, and do it again. And we broke through. We invented new ways, we refined new ways to come to these answers, and then we announced how old they were.
And the answer is?
Young. Incredibly young. so young that it was unbelievable. In fact, there you see their tiny little brain at 230,000 to 330,000 years ago. More than 1.5 million plus years is what they should have been by their looks. Right in the middle of Africa at the time when only Homo sapiens should have been there. At the exact moment when we thought that modern human mind was arising from all the archaeology that was appearing. We were seeing the development of more complex archaeology coming along. And that blew everyone away.
And how confident are you of those dates?
I am confident that some of them are that old.
Which is all you need, really, to make
Yes.
the point.
Yes. My hesitancy in your answer is that we've obviously been continuing the research. And I suspect that things are going to change. I think that we have encountered something extraordinary. The idea that if a small-brained primitive hominid, and by the way, it doesn't mean our colleagues are wrong, that Homo naledi doesn't exist at 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million years. You remember the coelacanth example that I gave? What it means is these groups of them, at least some of them, aren't that age.
Right.
But it means they existed back then. It also means they could come forward in time. We're not witnessing an extinction event. So I think there's going to be big news in the future about the range, the time range. And, just because you happen to be talking to someone who kind of maybe knows that there are going to be alterations in that.
And this is one cave area, right? You have many other places,
Sites potentially. We have yet to find definitively Homo naledi elsewhere, but I would caution you, if you go back to that brief anatomy lesson I was talking about, it'd be hard to see something like this if you didn't have the whole picture. And it would be easy to take bits and pieces and mix it into other things that we had and not see the whole, particularly in a record that has been as sparse as we have when you look at this mosaic anatomy. We are on the edge of just incredible things, Brian. I mean, we've been at this. By the way, I didn't stop exploring. We have made other discoveries in other places. I learned my lesson from Gladysville and learned my lesson from Sediba. I learned my lesson from this. I didn't stop exploring. During COVID, we discovered 250 meters away from this site, an entirely another giant site full of hominid fossils, but not these fossils. Something different. And that was really cool too, because COVID was great for us. Don't hate. It knocked me off my pedestal of success. It took me out of this rut of, here I was, I built this gigantic organization that was based on scientists. We make a discovery, scientists fly in from all over the world, they work with it, they mentor all of my young scientists in Africa. We get the papers out, we describe them, off we go. My teams are working in confined, humid spaces underground where if they get stuck, we have to send in other people to rescue them. And we're all working in, even our preparation was in these rooms together that are likely probably poorly ventilated, but don't say that. And then a pandemic comes along. And I went from hero to zero in minutes. South Africa did not have an easy lockdown. I know you didn't too, but ours was worse than yours. And so I had to start over. And it made me redesign it, and I had to figure out how to excavate a site, and so I did. And I couldn't work underground, so I took the underground and brought it above ground. Watch the YouTube videos, it's really funny. And it also made me realize that I'd made a mistake with my idea that bringing in the best and brightest scientists all the time was a way of mentoring the young African scientists who were coming up. What it also was doing was they could do it better and faster. So it was a form of mentoring, But it also meant there was always someone right above you that you couldn't be through. So I'm standing here with this discovery that we made in the middle of COVID. We brought the cave up, and there they were, these new type hominids. And I had all these young people around me. And I said, what I haven't done is I haven't given them the leadership on this. So I did. And you know what they did? They did great. They just turned on the afterburners.
All right, so you're watching all these wonderful discoveries taking place, but you're close, but one step removed, watching it in a television monitor, a computer screen. You must have wanted to go down, right, to be part of it.
I used to cover up that desire. From the moment that Stephen Pedro showed me those images and described the situation, and when I crawled up there and sent Matthew down and was staring down into that void, I knew I'd never fit into this space. I used to joke that, my ego was too large to actually fit into that chute area, and a lot of that was a way of covering up that I just couldn't do it. The people that were going in are fit; they're smaller than me, and things began to change as over the years I was watching this, and I'm watching it through these video screens. I'm remote from it, but just before COVID, we made a discovery, and that discovery was sort of shocking, I think, to all of us. I was in the command center. Kanewe Moliapane, one of my mentees, was sitting next to me, and we were watching the underground astronauts excavating. And they had moved the camera that day, so it sat up above them, behind them, over their shoulder. It normally sat on the side, so I could be monitoring where their hands were, saying, hold on, that looks like a mandible, this looks like stop, and they moved it because it was in the way of the excavation. And it was an infrared camera. And a weird thing happened, because as they would shift occasionally, they would block the light that was adjacent to them, that we were shining on it, and it would shift infrared. And in a moment, I was sitting there staring at this excavation. You gotta remember that's happening for days and days and days of the tedium. You're like in NASA watching a space flight occur where you can never touch it.
Right.
And I saw this shift, and I realized that there was an edge to what they were digging. I could see a physical feature. And I turned to Kenny, and I said, do you see that? And she looked at it, and I said, this is a line. This is a feature. And I suddenly realized something that had maybe been sitting in the back of my mind and some of our scientists through this remarkable thing where we're looking at this assemblage, the world's largest assemblage of hominids, coming from these tiny areas. We'd always been terrified to say the words burial. I'd been super careful over the years to say ritual disposal of the dead, because we're dealing with a hominid with a brain slightly larger than chimpanzee. Burial graves, that's a human thing. In fact, if you had to talk about something that almost defines a big brain human behavior, that's the thing. That's it's one of the things.
And the earliest known ones to that point were like 100,000 years at most.
78,000 to 85,000,
Right.
It's young.
Yeah, sure.
And Neanderthal's younger than that. And controversial. And I'm staring at it, and I realized this is a hole in the ground. They've been digging a hole in the ground with a curled up body in it. One body in a fetal position. And suddenly I could see it from a trick of a light. And I told them to stop. Oh boy, they were not happy. I will tell you that. They were, because they're right here. They are, and this is a terrible place. You're risking your life every time you go in. Well, we'd do the science. We'd do the excavations. We would find out it was a burial. It was a grave. Homo naledi went in and dug holes, put whole bodies in them in a flexed position, like a fetal position.
You can actually see the remnants of the hole that they dug.
And you can see the remnants of the hole they dug, even to where the dirt clods are tossed out of it. Then they put those back on.
Wow.
And you suddenly find out all the mysteries, why we were getting these dense bodies. The first excavation we worked in back in 2013, where we recovered that incredible assemblage of hominid parts from 1 meter by 50 centimeters. You know why? It was 4 or 5 overlapping graves, like a medieval cemetery, where they dug through, didn't know the body was there, tossed them together and put them back. It explained the articulated remains. It explained why there were vertical bones, because the bodies had been sitting up and had collapsed on themselves. The material we saw on the surface was stuff that had dribbled out as the mound of dirt settled below the bodies. Then we found the same thing in the hill antechamber. We found children, 4 of them in one hole. One little 13-ish year old body curled up the whole body. 2 faces, just the faces of children, and a fetus in one hole, in a slope.
And nothing else, no grave goods or anything?
Well, funny you should ask, because when we scanned this, we actually took it out in a plaster jacket, whole, which was no mean feat. You've heard the description of this thing. It had to fit through 17 and a half centimeters. So we had to get this thing up. It weighed probably 70 kilos. You can imagine getting up that 12 meters. When we scanned it with a CT scan, there was one rock in this whole thing. You can see the base of the grave. You can see where they dug into it. And that rock is sitting in the hand of the child that's curled into a fetal position. And it's shaped like a tool. Now, no human being has ever touched that to this moment. It's still in that plaster jacket.
Oh, is it?
We've synchrotroned it. We have it at 30 microns. In this paper we've just published, we've been very cautious that calling it a tool-shaped rock. But I'm not much of a betting guy. I'm a scientist, but I'll tell you, it shouldn't be there. There's no other rocks like that. And it's shaped exactly like the first tool with art on it from Blombos Cave at 78,000 years, done by Homo sapiens, shaped identical. It looks like a kind of engraving tool.
And but it's in the child's hand.
It's literally sitting in the child's hand. Is it or isn't it? It's probably going to be argued for the next either 100 years or the next few months until we find another
100
one.
other ones, right, yeah, right.
But so, you started this with getting down there. At the beginning of last year, I'm turning 57 that year, 2022.
Spring chicken.
Yeah, not so much, not for caving. And I was staring at these papers that we were preparing, and this is a big deal. I think this is the biggest discovery I will make in my entire career. I mean, we're about to describe a non-human species that buries its dead potentially hundreds of thousands of years before humans invent that. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think it is the biggest deal. And as we're writing this paper, which I think is probably going to be the biggest paper that I will participate in my entire life, all these contradictions begin to appear. Ideas of geology, geological problems that didn't make sense. That we had still a geologist or two were saying, no, well, there's some lateral flow or movement of material, maybe water's involved. And yet all the geology, all the thin sections say that's not true. There were problems with the way that we were describing the relationship between the two burial chambers, the hill chamber and the naledi chamber. And there were a bunch of little sort of minor things, but I'm sitting here thinking, I cannot put out this gigantic discovery that is literally going to affect archaeology and paleoanthropology forever if we don't have everything. And so I started looking at myself. I had, of course, like everyone, put a little bit of COVID kilos on. And I've always been a big guy, and I'm tall. And so in February, I realized that we were going to have expeditions in the middle of the year into this area. I wanted to excavate in the chamber adjacent to the burial chamber, Dragon's Back, where we kit up and get ready to climb and go down. You've seen those images now. And so I started losing weight. My wife and daughter were like saying, oh, you got COVID kilos. So I just was quiet. I didn't tell anyone. I started losing weight. And
by just eating less?
Eating less, eating high protein, smaller portions, starting to work out a lot. And lost 25 kilos.
25?
25 kilos.
So
Big chunk of weight.
50
I'm back to
odd
32
pounds.
inch weight. I hadn't been that since I was in the Navy.
Yeah.
and coming up on the expedition in July, the day we started the expedition, Canelway was going to be leading the team excavating in the Dragon's Back chamber. I climbed up. We had a documentary crew filming us at the time, and I climbed up Dragon's Back with some colleagues who had flown out for this work from the U.S. And I got to the top, then at the back of Dragon's Back where the chute is. And I took them up there, showed them that. They'd never seen it. They go down as they hook harnesses and go down this hard climb, and I stayed. And I slid back into that space. And it did something I'd never done before. I slid into this chute.
Thinking you were going to go down, or
No,
just
not right
checking
there.
it out?
Not right there. Not right there. It's you do not go down alone.
Yeah,
It's
I don't
not
think you just freelance
But I
this thing.
slid into it and dropped myself in, got my pelvis back and waist, and then stared down into the abyss.
Wow.
So I can make this. So I came out, had the days in briefing, and said, I'm going to make this attempt tomorrow. You should have seen the faces of my explorers. They were not thrilled, I think, but some of them were like, you can do this. Others were like, you could see And so the next morning.
Did you have caving experience
I've been for decades.
Okay.
So
it wasn't a matter of the
it's not
technical,
experience,
it's just
it's
whether
not
your body
technical,
could
it's where
fit.
my body can fit.
Okay.
And I would be by far the largest person that's gone in, both in physical dimensions and height.
Yeah.
Only 47 humans had ever been in that space. And because of the danger and the difficulty. And so the next morning, I made the attempt and got in. And from the moment I got in, I knew this was the hardest thing I'd ever do in my life. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, it's not a chute. I don't know how we've described it like that. That tells you it's a vertical chimney-like thing. It's not. It's a labyrinth. And you're moving actually laterally, almost 5 meters as you move down this. And that's a long way when you're moving through spaces that you can't even turn your head nor see your feet. And that's before you get to the 17.5-inch squeeze, which is about halfway down, 6 meters or so down. And I got to that, and I pushed into it and realized that I had to make a decision because it's not going down. You got to come up, too.
Yeah.
Going down, you have gravity. And I hit my chest and realized that if I push this next thing, I might not be able to get out of this. And we can't, I answer all those questions. No, we can't modify it. It's a labyrinth of chert layers and stuff, and this is gigantic ancient dolomite. You break the wrong stick on this,
Collapse.
that whole thing can come down.
Yeah.
Not only destroying the fossil situation, but killing you in the process and anyone else near you. It doesn't collapse in little bits. And so I pushed in and went on in. And now that was emotional and everything, but I get in, finally, and it was hard. And I'm sitting in the hill antechamber standing there. And I was very emotional. You haven't been able to breathe properly, so I'm hyperventilating kind of thing probably, because I didn't think I'd ever be in there. And I'd done a funny thing, which you'd appreciate. I decided I was not going to take a picture because I've been watching this place digitally for almost, 3/4 of a decade. I wanted to narrate. So I took a narration out and I started talking, describing everything. I had a measuring device and talking and describing everything. And I start describing these and I immediately start seeing things we missed, like simple things that don't mean a lot to people right now, but the dirt wasn't coming out of the chute. And we've actually written that. I don't know how we quite missed it, but it's coming out of another passage. So the dirt that's in the chamber is coming from the interior of the cave. No one was throwing bodies into this. It didn't come, the dirt's not coming from where we're coming in. We're just coming in the way we can fit.
So there's another.
Well, there's internal entrances that don't go anywhere.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Then I noticed that flow stones on the ground had been broken, but not by us, in the deep past, and moved uphill, plates. Homo naledi had broken them to get to the dirt underneath, to bury the bodies underneath. Because Flat plates don't move uphill.
Yeah.
And these are little things that people have been in there, but only like 3 geologists have ever been in there. People quit noticing these things. It's backyard syndrome. You and I have talked about that before, the idea that you quit seeing places you're familiar with, particularly places that are hard to get to. You've almost died getting there and you're worried about getting out, and you're there to do a job. And then I get to the edge of the chamber, and there's this passage that leads from the hill burial chamber to the naledi chamber, where the big burial places are. And it wasn't like what I imagined seeing on images. When you're there, it's totally different. It's a doorway. And I say this, I say, it's smaller than I thought. It looks like a doorway. And I'm an archaeologist. I see doorways. What do you see above doorways? What do you see? There's a doorway. What's above it?
The exit sign.
Yeah, a sign.
Yeah.
And I looked at it and looked to the left and actually couldn't believe what I saw. There on the left-hand side were carvings, engravings, symbols. First thing I saw is a cross. One up right side up, one upside down. A box, a square. Then you saw triangles. I saw a fish-shaped image. I don't know if it is a fish or not. It's a non-geometric image. Ladders. It was incredible. All etched into this 2.9 billion-year-old rock. And people had just walked by them.
Isn't that insane? I know, I gather the backyard, I get it, but you have trained team, the world's great, wouldn't someone, did it surprise you?
I've thought a lot about that, obviously, because, I go to them, I look at them. I almost had a transcendent experience. It was really weird, and I'm often embarrassed to even talk about it like this, but I know why it happens physiologically, but that material, I looked at them and they actually floated off. When I turned on a black light onto them, they floated in space, kind of like Queen's Gambit sort of stuff that you see on A Beautiful Mind. Yeah. And I know why it happened. It's a light shift phenomena. You would understand that. It's what happens when you see car lights at night as they move in the opposite direction. You know why your brain does it, but it's still very weird. Yeah. I was probably as close to a trance state as you could probably get, from exhaustion and fear and all that kind of thing. But I think that Pathfinder syndrome had sort of built in. It's a dangerous place. The first people in are risking their lives. Everyone's preaching, get back alive. That's the thing. That's why so few people live. And you become very mission focused. We were there to dig. Almost always we were digging in those far chambers. By the time the 3rd, 4th, or 5th person has gone in, everyone gets the explorer mindset, which is so dangerous. Smart, just what you said. Smart people have been here, that they've seen everything that's here. That's not my job. My job is in there. I think that's what happened. And I'm there with a different mindset. 1, to solve problems, and 2, I know for damn sure I will never be back in this space.
This is one shot.
This is my first and last time to be in here.
Right.
Anyway, I describe them. I am blown away. I can't believe it. I'm looking at engravings, and I know no humans have been in here other than us. These aren't us. And I could see there were layers. They'd actually erased older images with dirt from the ground and then carved through them again, maybe to highlight them. We see that in Upper Paleolithic images all the time. And these images, I knew, look like the things we see Neanderthals doing. We see, well, not so much that, but humans doing, the earliest engravings, these geometric forms. It looks like the earliest art. Anyway, I go through the whole cave. Over the next 3 hours or so, I discovered soot on the ceiling that we hadn't seen. Our explorers hadn't been looking up. Fire was in there, and it was right in front of our eyes.
Because in earlier accounts, remember, it was saying there's no evidence.
No evidence, fire. And when you and I talked about this, fire's hard to see at a couple of, we talked ourselves out of the obvious. Scientists are human too, folks. They're human too. And, these things happen all the time. There are thousands of scientific discovery stories just like this, aren't there?
Yeah.
Where someone suddenly sees something right in front of everyone else. And I finish, and I'm coming back down this passage, and I decided to do a funny thing. I'm coming out, all I'm thinking about is I've got to survive this climb out. And then I say, you know what? This is my last chance in here. I want to be the height of naledi. And so I got down on my knees in this passage and started crawling, and I got back, and just opposite the back of those images carved on the left-hand side of the doorway, so now it's the right-hand side of the passage, I see this gigantic crosshatch type hashtag with crosses. I mean, gigantic, right there, as bright as that exit sign. I'd even walk by it on the way in, and there it was, carved deep into this, over an algal stromatolite billions of years old, and then done multiple times.
So somebody worked hard to create this.
And multiple times. You know, I discovered the earliest symbols ever created, first time humans have recognized symbols created by a non-human species with a brain slightly larger than a chimpanzee's. We've seen that something, I mean, none of us, burials are one thing. Meaning-making symbols carved into the wall above those burials and in the passages, we thought that's us, but it's not us. And it's hundreds of thousands of years before us thinks about that.
Now, one question immediately comes to mind, and I'm sure it's been thrown at you 1,000 times, but at what point do you think you're reading more into it? Like, could it just be like the mindless doodles of the unconscious mind, just, they're down there and...
I'm not reading anything to it. I haven't said the word art.
Yeah.
I haven't said the word, I said they're meaning-making symbols. Even an unconscious doodle is a meaning-making symbol.
Right.
Nothing does that. Nothing on the planet that we are aware of has ever done that other than large-brained humans and possibly Neanderthals, which are large-brained humans.
And how do you distinguish it from other things that are, granted, are different, but like bowerbirds, when they make their nest to try where they make an elaborate design, that's a radically different kind of thing.
Radically different kind of thing. That's a sort of, I believe that I think we may, as humans, be in a moment where we're about to lose
our specialness,
human special nature, the idea of human exceptionalism. Maybe just died. I don't know if that's that different. I know we made it different, but Homo naledi just proved to us that another species with a brain that's not our brain,
and much smaller,
but incredibly smaller, accomplished effectively the entire cultural package that probably was used moments before for the definition of what it means to be human.
It's an absolutely remarkable story, and it is something that we will all be looking forward to. And, thanks enormously for all you're doing to clarify where we all came from.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you guys. By the way, I love Brisbane. Oh my goodness. I'll get in trouble for this on YouTube, but it's like Miami without people. Miami. Thank you. He said that. I'm going to say it too. And secondly, I just want to say one thing. I hope what you get from this, because I really want to inspire, I speak to kids all over the world. And part of what the thing is often they're depressed about the idea that they don't know how they're going to contribute. Young scientists, they're told that all the great discoveries have been made, that if you're moving in, you're just standing on the shoulders of giants. And the reason I wanted to tell my whole story is I hope you see that that's just not true. We haven't touched discovery. We are at the front edge, and I'm a field that thought it was over 20 years ago, that there was nothing left to find. And if it can happen in a field like this, what must it be in every other? I know you are a believer in this, but we are at a moment, I assure you, that the greatest age of exploration was not when guys went out on ships and introduced themselves to a place that was already found, like Australia. It's right now.
Absolutely.
This is the greatest age of exploration. This is an age where you are all explorers with us. That we have technology. We can ask questions and brilliant minds can invent it. And if not, some of you will invent it and give it to us and share it. You have all of humanity's knowledge in a phone in your pocket. And there's stuff to find, folks. Just never stop exploring.
So please join me in thanking a great explorer in the great age of exploration.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.